really can't eat before Christmas before a show.
Wow. What about this?
I'm usually quite busy. No.
I'm not gonna eat anything because I have an interview on Tuesday. So that salad is yours. I'm gonna food you bought. Hi. 1 second. It's recording. Give me a kiss. 1 second. 1 second. It's recording. Hi guys.
Hello.
Hi. Aaron, you here?
Hi.
Hi. All right,
We'll
so we're
wait
waiting.
for we'll wait for Richard, I assume. I think
Sure.
he has the latest deck at this point.
Did you guys check out that new documentary about the Prigozhin?
The front line, you mean?
One second. There's a one that just came out. Here's Richard. I'll post the link here. It's really amazing. Here's Richard. Hi, Richard. You here?
Hi, how are you?
All right, good, good, good. Let me know if everything works. Um, how's everything?
Things going well. Just give me a second.
No, no problem.
Is Aaron here?
Aaron is
Yeah,
here.
I'm here. Of
Hi,
course I'm here.
I might have to lean on you a little bit more today than usual. Hope that's
That's
okay.
fine. No problem. Just like the song says, lean on me.
Sounds like a plan. All right. So we'll wait for the sevens for everybody to show up as is
Yes.
typical. And let me get my video up and running. There we go.
I got my video too. Just give me a second.
By the way, Aaron, do you have any slides of your own or
I think we'll just go off of your slides right now, if that's okay.
that's fine.
Yeah.
So for some background, one of the things that Aaron and I have talked about, offline, is that we've noticed that there's a lot of interest in Ukraine and Israel, and we're definitely going to touch on those. That's in fact the earliest in our presentation. But a lot of 2023 has been a number of other conflicts or world changes, and these have not gotten as much press as Israel or Ukraine. And as I've said during my Israel presentations, I think the interest in Israel has absolutely nothing to do with Israel and everything to do with what people can reinterpret the Israel conflict as representing to them, right? So if somebody's against imperialism, then the Israel conflict looks like a lens to view anti-imperialism. If somebody is in support of uh, Muslims around the world, then the Israeli-Palestinian conflict looks like a place for that. If somebody sees the restoration of Israel as a religious goal, then it conflict looks like that. And so these other conflicts don't have that kind of ability where you can sort of impose your view of reality onto that conflict, and therefore they don't get as much press. And that to me is relatively saddening because, these conflicts are still shaping our world, still causing an immense amount of harm. And it also distorts our view of where the conflict zones are and why different areas of the world are uh, increasingly coming under threat. So that was sort of the genesis of this idea of why don't we just talk about the wider scale of conflict around the world.
We're all about conflict. Sorry, had to lean
And
into that one.
like what do you talk about, with respect to, I don't know, Germany, right? We can talk about
Sure.
how Germany is giving away a lot of military
Changing.
equipment and also having an economic collapse as cheap energy is decreasing. But other than that, like there's not really much of a
Well, yeah,
German story
exactly.
to tell.
Whereas I think one as an example, which is happening real time and getting zero press really, is what's going on in Pakistan right now is just astronomical politically. I mean, they are, they just jailed, I mean, whatever, re-jailed, I guess would be the right word. Their ex-prime minister Khan while he's in jail for a illegal marriage, which, they're sort of making up on the fly, and banning his party and it's I mean, it's arguably um, the largest earthquake in Pakistani politics since Bhutto. And that's just sort of sliding right by, right? Just one of a whatever. I found one story a year in BBC on that, which is strange for BBC given its history and or English history and so on. But that sort of proves the point. If the BBC covers it once a year, and everybody else is maybe covering it once every 3 years. That's big credible news sources. So there's just and I think that's the point, is that in a lot of ways, Ukraine and the war between Hamas and Israel is sort of just sucked all the oxygen out. I mean, Ukraine sucked a lot of it, and then I think the war with Hamas and Israel just basically sucked the rest of it. Plus, got like extra canisters, and that's it. There's just not room for anything else. And I
Yeah,
would encourage people just to go into the just do a basic Pakistan news Google search and click under news items, and you'll just be shocked. It's just, I think it's probably the most underreported major story of the last 4 or 5 years, um, because as the world is sort of shifting in good and bad ways, but it's shifting. But places like Pakistan are just completely regressing. Um,
yeah. All right, I think it's time to start. So these are the rules for those who may be unfamiliar. This is not an academic presentation. Aaron and I are not academics, nor are we qualified in the by universities in history, religion, politics, or any of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. We're lay individuals who have an interest in these areas of the world, and hopefully we can share that with you and talk about these problems with you. Um, this is also going to be a secular presentation. We try not to take sides or have some sort of religious perspective on what is happening. Um, we like to follow Will Wheaton's law of being respectful. Um, and we love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. We do respond to the chat and will discuss things in real time. Alternatively, you can wait for the question and answer section when we will allow people to raise hands and talk. This presentation, to the extent it is a presentation, will be a 101 and a 201, meaning that we're going to try and go a little bit more in depth than what you might see on the news. And we will have a 2-hour hard stop on wherever our discussion is. This will be recorded and you can watch it later on our YouTube channel. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel at this link. You can join our meetup where you can find out information about upcoming events at this link. And of course, if you feel like what we're doing is valuable, you're, uh, you know, uh, these are the links for our PayPal donations. Patty, I think you want to talk about the AI assistant. I, I mean, I don't know who that is and why that's operating. I'm not opposed to it, but I just don't know what it is.
The only reason I'm asking is because since we are recording it and it is available, and AI is such a hot button and poorly understood issue right now, I'm just wondering, since we're talking about the rules, I'm just wondering if people are completely comfortable with that. I mean, whoever Dave Wilson's autopilot is, certainly can watch it on YouTube.
Yeah, no, look, If there's a way to disable it, I mean, I don't know how you would do that, but
I think the same way we admit and block other people.
I mean, I don't see it in the list. Dave's
Yeah.
autopilot. There it is.
Dave Wilson is. Sorry, it's me.
Dave Wilson is what, Zach?
Oh, somebody just left by the name of Dave. Maybe that's what it is.
No, I just kicked them out.
Okay.
There we go.
I think it's a little, it's too understood, not understood. And this is recorded, so anybody can access it.
So we've discussed in previous sessions what happened on October 7th, that there was a raid led by Yahya Sinwar, planned by Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Dayef into what is into the area of Israel that surrounds Gaza, called the Gaza Envelope. During this raid, around 1,400 people were killed or kidnapped, and that has resulted in Israel beginning a war against Gaza in order, with their stated aim of removing Hamas. That war, though, had a number of predicates, right? The fact that the October 7th massacre was as successful as it was from the Hamas perspective is because of a number of issues in the Israeli government, allocating more forces into the West Bank than had been on the Gaza Strip, using primarily signals intelligence to try and determine when something would happen, and also ignoring on the ground information that was positing that an attack would soon occur. To the extent that the Israeli war effort progressed into the Gaza Strip and then began to occupy it formally as compared to the previously existing blockade. The Israeli military control started by encircling Gaza City, and as that occurred, we started seeing large numbers of fatalities, both civilian and militant fatalities, and that number has continued increasing up until today, where the combined total is around 26,000 and still rising. Now, we discussed last time that the encirclement of Gaza City was nearly complete, that there was attempts to go into Gazan medical facilities, under which the Israelis claim there are weapons facilities and other sorts of Hamas structures. And we also talked about how during the truce period, which was from 23rd of November until the 1st of December of 2023, that increases of supplies were able to make it into the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip, of course, having been cut off from their traditional sources of supplies, and under increasing Israeli naval blockade and Egyptian and Israeli land blockade. Over the course of the truce period, roughly 130 Israelis and foreign abductees and 240 jailed Palestinians were swapped for each other, but this still left a significant number of the hostages in the Gaza Strip and didn't end the hostilities, which started again, as I said, on the 1st of December 2023. And so there have been several recent events that have begun to occur in the Gaza situation. The first one is that starting in the latter part of 2023 and into the early part of 2024, South Africa put forward a case to the International the International Court of Justice. And the primary animus of this is that Israeli political leaders have made statements and performed actions based on those statements that are causing a genocide of the Gazans within that territory. They've pointed to about 20 different political statements made by Israeli leaders, and these statements are quite negative towards the Palestinians, talking about their elimination or about their destruction. And many of them don't seem to make a clear distinction between Palestinian people and the Hamas government, which is what Israel claims it is going into Gaza to attack. the International Court of Justice came to a resolution on this court case, arguing that Israel is committing genocide and that actions should be taken to bring about a ceasefire. However, none of those actions came with any sort of implementation mechanism. And the vote of the International Court of Justice was not unanimous. There was one or two justices that on certain of the resolutions or all of the resolutions voted against the majority, which found that there was genocide occurring. At the same time, investigations in January into UNRWA, which is the United Nations Relief and Workers Association, designed to promote the welfare of Palestinian refugees and created in 1949 for that express goal. Several of the members were believed to have been part of the October the 7th attacks, having joined in with Hamas and other Islamist militants that had entered into Israel. And so UNRWA has begun dismissing these individuals, but for countries like the United States, which is the primary funder of UNRWA, this was too little too late. And so the United States, along with several other countries, you can see the flags in the picture, have decided that they are no longer going to provide funding to UNRWA, which has cut their ability to operate down substantially. I think all of these countries combined are roughly 40 to 45% of UNRWA's budget. And so the organization is going defunct, which will lead to an increasing impoverishment of the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, since UNRWA was one of the main avenues through which resources would be extended to those people. With respect to Israel's increasing penetration into the Gaza Strip, on the 14th of January, Yoav Gallant, who is the current unity government defense minister, argued that Hamas had been completely dismantled in the northern part of Gaza City and that they were moving operations to the central and southern part of Gaza City. But a week later, it was clear, as Israeli troops had moved away from the northern Gaza area, that Hamas had not been completely dismantled, and there were further attacks, including the most lethal day for Israeli soldiers during the war, in which 21 Israeli soldiers were killed, meaning that Israel has had to resettle priorities, and it really puts a question mark on whether Israel can actually effectively dismantle Hamas and whether they can do it in such a short time frame.
Yeah.
Aaron.
Quick point here. So I believe there's sort of like an Iraqification going on. Like it's proportional to obviously this conflict and the scale of the combatants involved, but that Israel is in a process over the next probably 5 months, the low end 3 4 months, at the high end maybe 9 months of going through all of the Gaza Strip itself, but then given the size of their force and given the size of the uh, force of combatants and their infrastructure that's been developed over decades, um, and it's basically defensive urban. It's a blended territory between very, very dense, some of the densest in the world, to rural, to, in essence, sort of the suburban, urban sort of interface, um, all mixed together, what makes that almost, impossible, or very difficult over time, is that the way you interoperate your forces moving between those interfaces is very different. I mean, the kind of approach you take, the kind of mechanization that you have, the kind of support that you'd have to have, et cetera. So I believe that over the next, let's say, 6 months, 7 8 months, whatever, they'll declare sort of, we'll call it their mission impossible, mission accomplished. There you go, Freudian slip. But then that will kick off basically the Iraqification phase, where the same way as the U.S. in 2000, by the, let's say, late 2003, late summer really, early fall all the way through 04, the kinetic phase the basically the asymmetrical kinetic phase will kick off. And Israel has not, I mean, given the, um, let's say, competent questions and competence within this government of Israel, they're running this like a black box, right? Meaning it's like, it's operationally not very transparent, strategy wise. There's no, vision for the, termination of conflict except sort of these, large, sort of, I would say irrelevant goals that when you start to map them and materialize them, you can't, map total victory. What does that mean? Um, so I think that's when, um, the pumpkin phase begins basically, and is that and I'd say Israeli society is going to be stuck with this, um, Iraqification, which I just do not believe they've signed up financially by itself. In terms of the economics, because I think this war going on long term will be probably at least a 5 to 10% GDP hit for Israel, and so I just don't think there's the political will. I mean, none of this is being sold, as a multi-year, you know, I'd say, which to me is the minimum for something of this scale. Um, and the kind of political costs are just astronomical. So I think there's a real question mark here, that basically every 90 days they're sort of signing up politically for this, but they're going to lose internal political partners, because people, nobody signed up for a 3 year complete campaign in Gaza, which is something at this scale Israel has never fought. I mean, at this point, Israel's never had um, a war in their history to this scale, right? And in terms of the amount of forces called up, on active duty, utilized in combat, and rotating in combat, and
I
um, and
I
that's going to
think that
require.
I was gonna say, I think if you compare this to the wars against the Arab states in the 60s and 70s, you have something that's similar.
Yeah, I would
But
say that the reason it's not is you're looking at 500,000 in full training and combat, and let's say at least 200,000 in combat rotations, and beginning kind of what you call tour cycles, and not sitting at a border, waiting to make sure Egyptian tanks aren't coming through, but are, actively engaged. So, if you look, so this is almost like one of those big wars, but mixed with Lebanon, right? But at a scale of that big war. Like that's sort of what this is. This is like a blending of the two. And
yeah,
that's an enormous cost, right? I mean, when any state doing this, whether it's Russia invading, Ukraine, or Ukraine fighting back, or China, Taiwan, or anybody else, um, the costs are instantly begin at percentage points of GDP, and pretty soon get to 5-10% for obvious reasons. You're taking pretty much working age adults out of the workforce in enormous numbers, right? Somewhere in the order of about you know 8% of the Israeli workforce now is on active duty. Um, involved probably more like 13% when you count basically active reservists that are acting like active duty. So that's I mean, it's just math at a certain point, right? If those
yeah.
people aren't going to work, yeah, they're getting paid, but it's the work they were doing before is not getting done, and the kind of multiplier effect are very different. So
No, I think that even if Israel has tactical victories, and the rearming of Hamas in North Gaza shows that the tactical victories that they claim to have are very short-lived,
yeah,
the the GDP losses, the straining of the relationship with the United States, the rise of anti-Semitism around the world, um, these are all sort of negatives in Israel's book. So, and the problem is I don't see a way for Israel to win, right? Like if they withdraw, they've effectively demonstrated that Hamas actually can uh, operate in Gaza, and Hamas actually can hold Israel back. and the resistance is effective. If they
Which was always
continue,
inevitable. Yeah,
right?
which was always inevitable.
If
Yeah.
if they continue, right, then the numbers of dead Palestinians will continue to rise, which is a massive humanitarian crisis. And the collapse
Exactly.
of UNRWA and other agencies that have been supporting the Palestinians effectively means that these issues will continue to compound. One of the things that Israel thought that it could do if it cleansed northern Gaza is that it could begin to allow some of the Palestinians to return back to their homes in North Gaza. But with the conflict returning there, that effectively has been forestalled. We also see the diplomatic pause that Israel was basically very close, if not on the verge of signing some kind of agreement with the Saudis. And of course, that's completely off the table now. So it's one of those situations where there's no, I don't think Israel actually has a win situation.
That's right. And I would say any of these sort of I call it the resort plans, right? Like we've cleared an area of uh of combatants, whatever that means, and now we can things can move in and we can push the reset button. That's I think that was always completely delusional. It just doesn't it doesn't pass the sort of rational test. Um, so I mean that's why I'm sort of calling this the Iraqification, which is different than the Syriafication, right? I think that was a very different asymmetrical conflict. The Iraq one, quite a long time, was fairly contained inside Iraq. Not to say there's anything good about that, but meaning it wasn't bouncing off of other states at scale,
I
like
would
it did
also
with
say that
Syria.
the fundamental difference between Iraq and Syria is that in Iraq and in the Israel-Palestine conflict right now, you have one powerful traditional
Yeah,
military, and no equivalent power on the other side, but a lot of
right.
uh, intractable grassroots organization.
Yeah,
Um,
and I would
and
also say,
in Syria, you
yeah,
don't
go
have
ahead.
any dominance military power.
That's right. And you have a home team that has the ability to maintain much smaller asymmetrical approaches, meaning you don't need large battalions to look at it from like a military planning standpoint, right? You don't need to say, oh, hey, I need 2 battalions per grid square to do X when you have a home team which has, all of its asymmetry engineered in. That means a much smaller force measured in probably no more than, let's say, 2 companies can hold down 2 battalions and force a very protracted, very localized micro conflict just for that one grid square. And when quote unquote, it's defeated, it's not really defeated because you move on and then, maybe equivalent of 2 platoons that are still left sort of form back up again. And now it's a retrograde conflict constantly. And the thing that most people don't get, and clearly the Israelis don't, and the United States didn't, Iraq, and pretty much no Russians don't. I just don't think anyone big wants to get this because then it forces you to have planned differently. Is that in theory, if all you were going is 10 grid squares into something, this isn't a problem. When you go, 300 grid squares into something, these retrogrades just eat you up basically because the force protection becomes really what your operation is at that point. So you make highly incremental, and you see this now, right? You can guarantee this. So you saw it with Russia. You make highly incremental gains because you're spending 80-90% of your resources on force protection because
Yeah.
whatever you quote unquote overtook, you really didn't. And the way I think for most people, and I don't know if people think this way, probably don't, but I think the easiest way to think of this is think of it as like a 1, 2, 3 dimensional problem, right? So the Israelis will attack on the first dimension, claim victory, but there will be an asymmetrical response on a second dimension by Hamas and militants and all kinds of revolutionary fighters, et cetera, all the asymmetry they have. And then the Israelis can't have the same linear approach to the second dimension because it's all chopped up, it's fragmented. And so then that just gets up where you bog down, and then the asymmetry can then sort of go to the third dimension. And the reason I bring this up is that there's the land level, what we see above the ground, and then there's a subterranean conflict, and then there's a third dimension, which is large structures or structures themselves, right? And so when you're having, so you could have a single grid square, but you have buildings and you have subterranean. So the amount of force you might need to hold that could be it could be a whole regiment, basically, which is just, that's a math problem that doesn't work, which is why invading cities, right? Like why Russia's invasion was never going to work in Kiev. Like even if they didn't fight back, that wasn't actually going to work. It was
Well, I
just
mean,
because they didn't
the
have
Russian invasion in
anything to
Kiev
support
was to topple the government, right? That was it
Sure.
wasn't to hold the city. But
No,
we actually
exactly.
have a few comments that I'd like to address. The first one is that we didn't mention that Gaza has been under repeated blockades and occupations, right? Gaza was first occupied by Egypt from 1949 until 1967. It came under Israeli military occupation for a short time in 1956 to 1957 before being returned to Egypt. And in 1967, it came under direct Israeli military occupation. After that, it was partially handed over in 1993 as part of the Oslo Accords to the Palestinian Authority. And Israeli forces fully withdrew from the territory itself in 2005. In 2007, when Hamas came to power in the Palestinian Civil War, Israel instituted a blockade around the shoreline of the Gaza Strip, preventing anybody from moving further than 10 kilometers out. And Israel and Egypt collectively created a land blockade, which effectively turned Gaza into a situation where their imports and exports were highly regulated by Israel. Detractors have called this an open air prison. Supporters have argued that it's necessary in order to prevent Hamas from building tunnels and other military infrastructure.
Yeah, and I do think one piece that maybe going forward, because this conflict's not changing, obviously. I mean, it's changing, but it's not fundamentally changing. To maybe focus more energy on is sort of Egypt's historical role in this, and then how Egypt, present role is, because I think in some ways Egypt is um, is a co-determinant actor here. I think that's pretty clear, and I would say, um, in some ways Israel is taking some of that hit, 20% for Egypt itself. So Egypt's able to, um, in essence, um, from their perspective, uh, maintain security in this conflict. At the same time, Israel is performing the massive kinetic action in this conflict. But Egypt is not some sort of unknown actor in this, right? They're an extremely active actor and have been really, for the complete history of Gaza. And I do think that maybe at some point, maybe in a future presentation, we can spend some energy on sort of Egypt's historical role in the conflict, and then also Egypt's relationship with going back obviously to the 50s and 60s to the Palestinian revolutionaries, and then also ultimately to the authority, and let's say the present relationship with Hamas, which isn't much of a relationship, obviously. And then given the history with Muslim Brotherhood, where that took a different turn even from there. And I think that's something that isn't really well understood. It's not covered at all anywhere. It's not even covered in Israel, really. I mean, it's just not focused on.
Yeah. One of the other points that has been raised in the comments is sort of is whether or not what Egypt's role is in relationship to the Palestinian situation. And we covered this a little bit last time, but I'm more than happy to go over it again. Um, so when it came to the uh, the Arab-Israeli War of 1947 to 1949, and I'm including in that what's been called technically the Palestinian Civil War of 1947 to 1948, which was between the Jews and the Arabs, but not externalized. Um, there were two major forces that organized what we today call the Palestinians. At that time, they were called the Arabs of Palestine. So it's a little bit more complicated, but I'm going to use the term Palestinian anachronistically. And these two entities existed as Jaish al-Inqadh, or the I forget what it's called in English. Um, but the Jaish al-Inqadh was actually a Syrian creation that was led by Fawzi al-Qawqji, who was a Syrian, um, in Palestine, recruiting Palestinians. And by and large, it followed the Syrian political position and disappeared once the war was over. The other army, which was Jaish al-Jihad al-Muqaddas, or the Holy Jihad Army, if you want to translate it into English, was led by Haj Amin al-Husseini, and that military was strongly aligned with the Egyptian government. So after the war resulted in the Egyptians having military control of the Gaza Strip, the Holy Jihad Army and its leadership effectively became a government in the Gaza Strip called the All Palestine Government, Hukumat Amam Palestine. Now, this government was really more of a puppet of the Egyptians, who controlled and organized the entire territory through their military apparatus within the territory of the Gaza Strip. And we see Palestinian resistance towards Egyptian aims with respect to the Palestinians throughout the early period. And the early period is until the Israeli invasion in 1956 as part of the Suez Crisis. Now, one of these elements is the Egyptian attempt to remove all Palestinian nationalist leaders, be they on the left end being communists, on the right end being Islamist, and everything in between. And the attempt which was, and part of that was through UNRWA in its inception, to create long-standing towns for Palestinian refugees that had fled to the Gaza Strip to settle. The Palestinian nationalists refused this settlement primarily because it would occur within the territory of Egypt and could, in their view, vitiate their claims to the territories from which they were expelled by the Jewish militaries, which became the Israeli army in 1948. So they resisted this most strongly during the March Intifada of 1955, when both communists and Islamists joined together to attack Egyptian military posts within the Gaza Strip. As a result of this, Egypt abandoned all policies towards relocating Gazans to Egypt proper. And after 1959, when from 1956 to 1957, Israel controlled the Gaza Strip as part of the Suez Crisis, but Eisenhower used diplomatic power to push Israel out of the Gaza Strip, and so Egypt returned to control. But in 1959, they completely scrapped the all-Palestine government and began to rule directly militarily. And so the Egyptian position, now the Egyptians were kicked out completely in 1967, but the Egyptian position was always hostility towards the Palestinian national movement beyond anything that Egypt could directly control. And in fact, we see Palestine incorporated into the United Arab Republic, which Egypt declares in 1958, and all these other similar sort of situations where Egypt continually denies the agency of the Palestinians. When Hamas came to power in 2007, Hamas, of course, being the Palestinian wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Egyptian government, which was thoroughly antithetical to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, saw Hamas as an ideological ally of its enemy. And so it made sense from their perspective, especially since they had the military peace treaty with Israel starting in 1979, to treat the Hamas victory in 2007 as an existential crisis for Egyptian sovereignty. And this led to the militarization of the barrier between Egypt and the Gaza Strip. One of the ironies is that when Mohammed Morsi, who was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, who was elected to power in Egypt in 2012, when he came to power, and for the year that he was in power before being overthrown by military general Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, he maintained the Egyptian border. He didn't in any way change it to allow an increase of goods from Egypt to Gaza or make any substantive change in the relationship between Egypt and Hamas-ruled Gaza. I had pictures before of Egyptians, for example, Egyptian government officials flooding the convoy tunnels. So Egypt has had a marked choice in making sure that the Palestinian situation remains the same as it is. Of course, Israel has the dominant role, but Egypt could certainly change the dynamic on the ground if it wanted to empower the Palestinian government further, and that's simply not their aim.
Yeah, and I think that's a really key point that isn't really emphasized. That I think everybody has this deterministic. I mean, when I say everybody, I don't mean us here, but I mean, in the commentariat universe, in the analyst universe, this sort of permanent, a deterministic response in this conflict. I would say I would have always argued that in essence, Egypt has, in some ways, the house hand that if they played, if they wanted to, and that's the whole point. They never have, even under Muslim Brotherhood. If you sort of map the rhetoric of the Muslim Brotherhood for its 20 years before, 30 years before, to try to match it to its actions in its 18 months in power. There's a cognitive dissonance there. Obviously, it's pretty strong. That just isn't. It's just one of those things that's just not discussed. It's like poor form almost. And I would argue that Egypt, in some ways, could, even in this conflict today, as deterministic as it looks to, I think, many people, could upend the complete architecture of it, because whatever Israel would say rhetorically, they could not stop a large scale Egyptian controlled, we'll say, police action on its own border with Gaza, if that's what they wanted to do. And and I think that's pretty clear they don't want to do that, and they really never have. And to the point that if you look at the rhetoric from outside the government, even in Egypt, in many ways, Palestinians are treated and looked at very similar to how Syrian refugees are looked at in Turkey, as sort of, or other adjacent populations. For a long time, how Mexicans were looked at in America, or how people from
It looks like
any
there's a disruptive
adjacency.
force.
Exactly, it's a disruptive force, taking jobs, blah blah blah, crime, all the usual, suspects in terms of the 12 rhetorical statements anyone makes anywhere in the world about this. Koreans in Japan, or Vietnamese in Korea. I mean, it's just everybody has their little playbook about the same.
No,
And I think that's a dimension there that is really just not covered. And I recommend people just drill into it, because I think everyone sort of, I think, learned pretty close to about as much as you can about the conflict from an Israeli perspective, relative to this conflict and all the other conflicts in the world. But I do believe these adjacency actors have a lot to play in these conflicts. I mean, they really do. Poland is a
yeah,
great example of this too. Poland is the Egypt in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. If Poland had, changed some of its, I mean, they did, right? They allowed, 7 million or 6 million, I think, Ukrainians to come in. So that's an example, actually, of
right. No, it's a
someone
functional
doing that.
difference. Yeah.
That's right.
One of the things that we sort of talked about last time that we met is that there's not likely going to be an expansion of this war beyond the Israel-Gaza front, right? The other players in this war seem to want to have a hands-off approach, even Iran, which seems to be supporting its militant proxies in both Iraq and Syria, doesn't seem to be directing them yet towards an attack on Israel. The only real expansion of the war has actually been with respect to the Houthis in Yemen. And this picture from 2016 actually shows Houthis with pictures of Hassan Nasrallah, who is the leader of Hezbollah, and you can see that which shows their connection to uh, Iran and its proxies, of which the Houthis are one. So I wanted to address sort of what the Houthis are doing. Now you can see that the Houthis don't actually control all of Yemen. They control the northern part, where Zaydi Shia are the majority, and the Zaydi Shia are their primary constituency. This is a subgroup of the larger Shiite community, but it's the dominant strain of Shiism in Yemen, right? Yemen is divided between Sunnis and Shiites, Sunnis in the south, Shiites in the north. And the Houthis have argued that as uh, as a response to Western countries supporting Israel, especially the United States, cargo going through the Red Sea would now become open to them. They've launched several attacks, one of them being successful. That's that blue ship. The red ships are ships that have been struck, but ultimately either repelled the attackers or limped their way through. And this has caused a number of countries to decide to actually ship their goods around Horn of Africa, which is a much longer trip and a much more expensive freight haul. Accordingly, in order to preserve the traditional method by which oil is transported to Europe, because oil that comes to Europe usually comes through this Bab el-Mandeb, the strait that separates Yemen from the African coast. The United States led an international coalition to start bombarding Houthi positions along the Red Sea.
Yeah,
Aaron,
and I think one thing that's important to understand is when you're talking about shifting logistics and transport, it's a cascading effect, right? So you're adding a time, that's one dimension, which is typically weeks, which changes all the logistical planning and supply chain implications, which doesn't really affect the United States. So North America really isn't impacted here directly, very much. It's very, very tiny. But Europe is. Europe and China are, I would argue, and as China's wanted to shift to the EU as its new super export partner, basically, from the United States, this is having a fairly large impact on that relationship in terms of its logistics. It's very similar to a couple of years ago, if you're in North America, if everyone remembers all of the problems in the ports in the West Coast where ships were just piling up. And then all those cascading impacts of prices and misallocation of sort of planned goods and distribution. So you're going to see knock-on effects basically over time, especially in Europe and in China, which they're both having some struggles economically. So this isn't, this is not quite another strike against them, but I'd say half a strike at least, especially the longer this goes, because at a certain point, if like short the block of the Suez with the Maersk container ship a couple years ago. That was, that was a hit, but it was, after a couple weeks. When people say everyone's running on just in time, it's not truly just in time. It's not like they have one pencil left. It's that it's a network that's just in time. So there is an inventory. Just the inventory is thin and it's layered. But as you use all of that, now you have to go back to an old world planning model, which means you start planning in batches. And when you plan in batches, that changes everything at that. I mean, it changes how much capital you use. It changes
Yeah,
your
I was gonna say we should
distribution
clarify
network,
a little bit.
everything.
Wait, a
Yeah.
little bit how what you're talking about works. So when Europe is receiving, let's say, petroleum from the Middle East, right? That petroleum is offloaded from the ships into large drums. And so those drums are then what is circulated through the European system. So it's always
That's right.
that these ships are topping off the level in the drum. It's not that Europe runs
That's
out of
right.
oil and then they're like, "Oh,
And then
thankfully
orders
the
it
ship
again.
came and we can drink again." Um,
Exactly.
so if you have a shipping route that doesn't go through the Bab el Mandeb, that goes around the Horn of Africa, that takes that additional 2 weeks, the level in the drum decreases far more significantly between the last refilling, which went through the Bab el Mandeb, and the next one that takes an additional 2 weeks to get there. So that leads to a
That's right.
decrease in what's in the drum, which is the inventory. Um,
Yep.
there's
Oh, go ahead.
there's a
Yeah.
question here of, do you think the drone used to kill 3 U.S. military personnel came from Afghanistan or some other location, or do you think that this is a drone created by the Houthis, or can you talk a little bit
Yeah.
about that?
So a couple things that and this is in our sort of pile of conflicts that aren't covered. I mean, there is I mean, it exploded and then it sort of has moved out of the mainline news, but there was a pretty substantial kinetic strike and counter strike between Iran and Pakistan a few weeks ago that I was sort of surprised didn't get really much play because this wasn't small asymmetrical, right? It was state v state, and these were missile and airstrikes. So there's a and obviously for those of you that I assume everyone knows that between Iran and Pakistan and Afghanistan, so and in Western Afghanistan is is very strongly parts are very strongly aligned with with Iran, and also um, the relationship in Pakistan between its Baluchi people who had a long-term conflict with almost any power in Iran going back for quite a while because they've been a minimum second class, probably third class citizens objectively, because Arabs, many Arabs, Southern Arabs in Iran are in some ways second class citizens or have been. So that conflict is is there. So I think the Iranian proxification is extending. And by the way, I'm not convinced either. Iran is signing up strategically in all these tactical moves either, the same way as Israel is sort of stumbling its way. I think there's almost like a whole bunch of Iraqifications going on in this region right now that are all everyone's just sort of pushing go, pressing the gas, and nobody's really thinking through because Iran is not going to be able, just like no state is, to have to juggle half a dozen proxy active, substantial kinetic proxy conflicts simultaneously. Right? It's not a video game. It's not Halo. It's the real world. You have
Yeah,
decision making and proportionality and escalation and resources you have to figure out.
I would say it's one of the interesting things about what the Houthis have done since this attack is to make clear that that Russia is an ally of theirs, right? So they have
Yes,
they've issued statements, for example, that they're not going to target Russian, Chinese, or Turkish ships because Russia, China, and Turkey have argued that the Houthis are right to protect themselves or defend themselves. Houthis have sent representatives to Russia, but notice that they don't say anything about Iran in any of those statements. Now, they're
yeah, they
still
don't.
clearly aligned with Iran, but I think that this is Iran probably told them don't do anything, right? Which is the same message that we see Hezbollah
Yep,
following in Lebanon, where there's a low level quagmire, but nothing that'll actually invite retaliation.
exactly.
And this is obviously beyond that. So I think that there's probably at this point some kind of internal disagreement between the Houthis and the Iranians as regards how to deal
Oh
with
yeah, no, I mean,
the
yeah.
Gaza situation.
Yeah. My sense of the relationship of the Houthis with Iran at this point is very it's in the we'll call it the middle phase, the the pre-divorce, right? Everyone's just living together, but they don't talk to each other, and they have different schedules, everyone's just wondering, like when's the shoe gonna drop? Um, and 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 basically, the Houthis' new, dance partner, is are the Russians, and the Russians, um, you know, I, I think because of the um, conflict in Ukraine and in general Russia's, let's say, uh, very asymmetrical conflict, hybrid war with many states in the West. Iran is a sort of add-on partner to that, presumed more of a strategic relationship than really exists. And I think most know that, anytime you think you're in a strategic relationship with the Russians, like you're the one who's made the mistake. And I think the Houthis who would gladly take other dance partners, and I think Russia is a very strategic one for them
Yeah,
because, and if you look at what Russia has done, also replacing the legacy Wagner group in Africa, they're calling it, which I'm just really weird, but I think most people do too. It's called the Africa Corps, and it's spelled literally the same way the Germans spelled it, which I just think is even weirder. I mean, which is obviously not an accident, right? Like and so I think when people talk about the denazification in Russia, I think they should look first with the
well,
naming
I
of
mean,
their
it's a
proxy
180
group,
degree
the PMC.
denazification. Um,
Yeah,
but
I guess so. The true
but
rebranding, and but anyways, the reason I'm bringing this up is this is not an accident that they're moving through not just the Horn, but they're moving into anyone paid attention, which I know there's so much stuff like this. It's hard to pay attention. What I do, just so anyone wants to know, and not that most would care, is it's a lot easier to just have a random search every month by country and just say news, and then that it pulls up what's going on versus waiting, the old kind of push model, waiting for somebody to report on these things, because you'll wait for months and years and no one will tell you anything. It's because
yeah,
it just doesn't prioritize it. But I'll do Ethiopia news, I'll do Eritrea, and what'll pop up is, Russia, or not Russia, but Africa Corp, PM,
yeah.
private military contractor X just flew into Ethiopia, and signing cooperation agreements, blah blah blah. And so what you're finding is, I think, a strategic relationship that Russia's orienting themselves to in across Africa, especially East Africa. I think East Africa is kind of the hill they're going to die on here, where it's a very the U.S. and I would say Western allies have had sort of a free run there, and I think Russia's now going to challenge it. And if they have the Houthis as a proxy, the Houthis as a proxy are not Hamas, right? It's a different animal here, right? This is a big,
Yeah,
government
yeah, it's a much larger population
like
and a much more effective
structure.
military.
They have, basically the only thing they don't have is I mean, if you count drones as part of an air force, then yes, they have a very small partial air force, but they have helicopter companies, they have everything but jet, basically. And let's say small, medium ships
Yeah.
and above.
No,
And
we
if
have
they
a
can
question
count on the
here.
Russians,
We have a
yep.
question here to is there a way that we could say that Israel is in some way responsible for antagonizing this situation, or creating this situation? Um, and my view would be, other than the Houthis' ideological conflict with Israel, bringing them here, I don't really see that. I don't. There are possible theories that Israel, caused something to bring the United States or other allies into the region, and I would just push back on that, simply to say that Israel is very powerful in its very small sphere of influence. Israel is not very
Yeah,
powerful
exactly.
in creating international coalitions that will go after piracy. In fact, we've had international coalitions go after piracy in this region pretty much consistently since the 90s with UNISOM and similar.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
So this is
And
actually much more tied to that than it is anything to do with this specific
I
conflict,
would
other than the
say,
timing.
yeah, exactly. And wherever they have a direct land bridge is pretty much as far as they can go. I mean, the IDF does not have, and I'm not suggesting, Mossad agents, things like that. I mean, the Russian GRU has 50 times the force projection that the Israeli intelligence services have. I'm not suggesting operation to operation. The Israelis couldn't, match one operation at a time, but the Russians could run 30 operations. The Israelis could probably not run more than two or three, and they couldn't continuously run operations, right? And these are just small intelligence operations. Um, when you're talking about conventional forces, they don't really have a navy. They have a handful of corvettes, which are basically sort of at most a gray water, at most, I'd say, in the Mediterranean. That's about as far as they could go. I doubt they can even really fight across the Mediterranean, to be honest. So I think they're no more than a territorial navy. And their land forces, really can't go, further than the Sinai at the most. And I would say Lebanon is a big question mark given their history there. So the land force, so really it's all the Air Force. And if you look at what, and I think this is a mistake people make, is that the U.S. has always constrained Israeli long range strike capability in their Air Force, right? They've purposely not sold them refuelers. They've purposely sold them um, jets over the generations that have a very, I'd say, in proportion, limited range for what the Israelis, as a nuclear power. The fact that Israel does not have really a bomber strike capability is sort of prove that to you, right? And so I think people build a 800-pound gorilla out of this, out of Israeli capabilities, and it's 800 pounds in their backyard, but it's not. That gorilla loses a hell of a lot of weight very quickly, and it turns into a small zoo animal basically once you start moving more than a few hundred. I'd say more than 200 to 300 kilometers. Really, it's and I think a piece to the last piece to cover here is that what the Houthis really were doing is not triggering Israel. They were triggering a U.S. response, is what they were doing, because the U.S. has um, the only active large scale blue water navy in the world. And so the U.S. was going to go into the U.S. Navy is always in the Red Sea. It's the question of the scale. And now the U.S. has two, carrier battle groups. And when you have two, and the last piece on this, when you have a carrier battle group, once again, this stuff isn't like games. It's not like Battleship or like video games, right? It's not like you kind of move these pieces around simplistically. When the U.S. moves the battle carrier group from its existing mission, it backfills one to the existing mission, and it prepares another one for rotation to those two that are there on top of the 1 to 2 that are already on natural rotation, because a carrier doesn't live at sea permanently forever, and the sailors are locked in a prison, right? I mean, they're there on 6 month, max 9 month rotations. Many times they're only 3-4 month rotations now, because people realize the quality of life pretty much degrades pretty quickly. So that means really half the U.S. carrier capability, at least, is engaged in this conflict with the Houthis. Not maybe directly engaged, but is stacked basically. It's back to that same distribution, inventory, resource problem. It's like that's the modern world, right? The modern world is everybody wants to maintain. No one wants to go to the store and look at an aisle that's empty with something. And whether that's a political structure, that's a security one, that's an economic one. And that same thing is going on with the US Navy in the Red Sea, which the US Navy can maintain this for, they'll just add it into their area of operations. So it's not a
Yeah, especially
big deal
since we
for
have
the
a
US
port.
Navy.
Yeah. Yeah, especially since we have
Yeah,
a port in
exactly.
Djibouti. But let's shift
Yeah, that's right.
to Ukraine a little bit. So, a lot of the coverage around Ukraine has focused, for example, around the Russian siege of Advidka, uh, 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 Adiivka, and other places like that. And so it's been portrayed as a stalemate. In fact, we talked about this during our last Ukraine roundup, such as the siege of Bakhmut, which resulted in a very Pyrrhic Russian victory. We can say the Russians lost over 100,000 soldiers.
Oh, we got some. You mute somebody?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Um, but yeah, so you had this sort of fighting going on where, you're expending lots and lots of bodies for a small area of territory. And this is very similar to what we saw in the Iran-Iraq War, and this is very similar to what we've seen in World War One, which is where your defensive structures are far more effective than your offensive structures. And with the lack of a significant air force really on either side, um, a lot of the discussion, and it's the discussion that we had, focused on this sort of stalemate and this inability really to cross beyond the lines as they solidified, probably around March or April of 2022. Right, so the Ukrainians were going to plan to have this great summer offensive, and the summer offensive, it did move in the positive direction for Ukraine for the most part, but we're talking very few strategic territorial gains. Most of it was, a few meters here and a few meters there. And the Russian counteroffensive during the winter was similar, um, in that they made certain gains, a few meters, a few kilometers here, a few kilometers there, but by and large, the situation in terms of the border situation on the land between the Russians and the Ukrainians, um, uh, remained roughly in the same position that it was. Now, I wanted to shift focus away a little bit from that sort of stalemate situation, because I think that there are some noticeable differences between those two prior stalemate situations, be they the World War One and the Iran-Iraq War situation, because there are actual kinetic pieces that are going on outside of that strict land war problem. Probably the most famous one of these is actually the most recent. So let's start in terms of timeline. In December of 2023, Russian hackers actually tried to take down many of the different uh, telecommunications networks within Ukraine. Probably the most famous of these was the Kyivstar, Kyivstar being the largest cell phone carrier within Ukraine. They hacked it and took it down on the 12th of December. Kyivstar was able to recover in about a week, um, but it meant that there were significant communications problems throughout across Ukraine. And there were other significant issues related to Ukrainian infrastructure. You also have the destruction of large-scale Ukrainian infrastructure with Russian missiles. You can see this is a strike that hit a mall in the city of Dnipro in Ukrainian-controlled Ukraine. And that resulted in the destruction of, for example, this building. We have a number of civilian fatalities as a result of Russian action, but far more is the large scale effects of losing heating structures, electricity generating structures, and other things to help Ukrainians work through the difficulty of the winters. You also have pushes. Um, you also have diplomatic pushes by the Ukrainians in terms of international agencies and international organizations. And probably the most famous of the two are the following two. The first one is that Ursula von der Leyen and other leaders of the European Union have finally invited Ukraine for accession talks. Now, previously in 2022, Ukraine was added as a candidate for admission to the European Union, which means that there will be consideration towards the development of that situation of Ukrainian membership, but it's not that that membership is anywhere close on the horizon. Accession talks really begin the process of negotiating the admission of a country to the European Union. And it's very difficult to imagine that they will progress very far because of the Copenhagen requirements of joining the European Union. There are a lot of measures against corruption and democratic organization that Ukraine doesn't have. That would make acceding to the European Union very difficult. But it's very clear that the Ukrainian push to become a European Union member and to further integrate itself in the network has been showing diplomatic results. The other major international push is that the Ukrainians managed to get the Russians expelled from the 2024 Olympics. But the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, actually changed their position. Originally, it was going to be a full expulsion of all Russian and Belarusian athletes, but now they're allowing them to compete under what's called the neutral flag, which means that they can't sing their anthem, they're not allowed to wear Russian colors, but they are still going to be Russian athletes. And for a lot of Ukrainians, this is seen as the IOC capitulating in some sort of way to Russia, even though initially the IOC was moving in a more pro-Ukrainian direction in the diplomatic sphere. The third
So
category,
could I add a couple of things here? Sorry.
sorry, the
Oh,
third
go
and
ahead.
last
No, sorry.
is that Ukraine has been using drones to attack Russian positions away from the land-based battle lines. So you have, for example, the attack on the ship in Feodosia, which is the largest city in Ukraine and the second largest naval port after Sevastopol, where they took down a large Ukrainian ship. A few days ago, a separate Ukrainian ship called the Ivanovets was taken down similarly by a drone. And Ukrainian drone attacks are also attacking oil refineries on the Russian side of the border. The first one, and the most famous one, is the attack on Ust-Luga, which is close to St. Petersburg. But they've even managed to attack a refinery in Volgograd, which is 600 miles away from the nearest Ukrainian military position. So it shows that the Russian air defenses are incredibly weak. And the way that these fires were put out, such as the attack on Ust-Luga, which set the place ablaze, using water instead of foam, demonstrates that the Russians were not expecting this kind of attack and had not properly trained in how to contain these types of fires, resulting in them having much more damage than would originally be anticipated. Aaron?
Yeah, so I think what you're bringing up, which is great, is all of this shift in this conflict uh, to have both parallel political conflict and sort of large to medium-sized events that are sort of driving the narrative of the conflict. At the same time, the stalemate is just sort of operating in the background, and the stalemate becomes sort of the long war. And if we map the last 2 years, the Russians acquired about 100 square miles, and if we believe, which I think are fairly accurate, the casualty numbers, which is
Aaron, I think we lost you. Um,
sorry about that. You lost me there.
yeah, we lost you for a minute. We still
Okay,
can't
there.
see you.
Sorry about that. Oh, that's strange. Must have been a little internet instability there. Sorry. Um, so what I was can you hear me okay?
We
Or
can
no?
hear you. Yeah, we just can't see you.
Okay, great. Okay, let me just shut off video. That might just maybe make it better too. So what I was saying is that the Russians, have had about 300,000 casualties. I think are most of the estimates. I think that's a pretty safe number, and I'd say the Ukrainians have had similar numbers, probably at least 200,000. Um, but the Russians have gained about 100 square miles in 2 years. And so, it's cost them, and that cost seems to not change, roughly at least two.
I guess we lost Aaron again. But yeah, I think to sort of echo his point,
Sorry
the
about that.
amount of
Yeah.
hi. Go ahead.
Yep. Yeah. No, sorry about that. I don't know what's going on here. So it's something I guess. But no, what I was saying is that there's been about 300,000 casualties. I assume you heard that. And then for the Russians, and they're averaging about 2 to 3,000 casualties per square mile. And they uh, those numbers really haven't changed much in the last 2 years, and I don't think there's anything the Russians are going to do to change that, because the Ukrainians are, and I would say one thing that the Ukrainians are doing that's a major shift is that the Ukrainians were not building fixed defenses before, and now they are. So they're putting in place a very layered, even subterranean defense, which is going to be it's going to be very difficult for the Russians to force Ukrainians out of positions. Basically, every one of these towns is going to look like a Bakhmut fight, and that just keeps those numbers in the thousands that the Russians will have to commit and have casualties, and those fights will last minimum weeks, probably more like months in each one of those fights. And we're talking a lot of these towns are, I mean, all they are is towns, right? They're not cities. They're really somewhere between small to medium sized towns. And so, and Ukraine has, like anywhere else, hundreds, thousands of these, but hundreds of these on the Eastern Front. I mean, actually, probably a few thousand actually on the Eastern Front. And so, it's a forever long war from a Russian standpoint. And I think, I don't know if you were going to talk at all about this, I'd say, political crisis that's starting to form in Ukraine as we speak, because in essence the senior combat commander has been relieved, or is reassigned, whatever. But basically, what do you call it? Zaluzhne. I think I'm
Yeah,
pronouncing that
Zaluzhny.
correctly. I'll be correct. Yeah, and and he's been I'd say a fantastic commander. But I think many saw him as a challenger to Zelensky, and I'm really wondering now. I mean, what's going on here? Because I think in some ways, Zelensky might be falling into that trap, which is you either are trying to protect yourself politically, or you're trying to be a wartime leader, and you sort of accept like your
Well,
bust on
so
the mantle of hero, and that's that. And then you go, join boards of directors and do all those other things that hero of the nation type people do. And I think he's trying to have his cake and eat it. And I think um, that's a very dangerous thing for Ukraine's morale,
right, I agree.
because that to me is the issue. I don't really care about their sort of infighting, because they're going to have a leader, whether it's Zelensky or someone else. But it's the impact on the belief that there's unity of command, and that everybody is swimming towards the same objective. And I think this is a real test for Ukraine politics, especially right now, which I just find this a really strange move, right? Right as they're trying to push help push the European aid package through, which that aid package is all non-military, right? I think most people don't know that if it's an EU aid package, it's almost all non-military, and the military aid comes from the individual member states. And then there's the U.S. package that's completely stuck right now. And so to have this kind of combustible politics right now, I just find somewhat surreal. It doesn't really make sense. It's sort of their version of an own goal, like the whole Wagner mini coup, right? It's this chaos thrown in on their side, and they've been pretty good at
Avoiding that so far.
minimizing these. Yeah, they have. So, which is likely, this is my sort of soft prediction, meaning that they're regressing to the mean a little bit here. That they kind of had their A plus grades or A grades in their favorite classes for the first 2 years, and now they're taking the hard classes they don't really want to take, and they're being made to take, and now they're going to start having to make tough political choices internally, and you might start seeing more divisions. I don't know if the Russians can take advantage of that, because if the Ukrainian military just embraces robust fixed defenses, it's going to be impossible for the Russians to dislodge them at any scale. You're not going to see some mass World War I type retreat. I mean, it's going to be a World War I fixed war, which is arguably what's going on now. And the
Now,
last piece. Oh, go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, do you think
Yeah.
that because the only place that hasn't been adequately defended, let's say, is the seafront, could you imagine some kind of D-Day landing?
No.
No, why not?
Yeah. I mean, so, well, look, both, I mean, Ukraine for practical reasons, and for some non-supported reasons, doesn't have an air force really. It has this little pop-up, pop-down air force, right? So they kind of are like they're almost like a rocket launching air force, right? They kind of pop up, fire some standoff systems that they really fantastically hack into, being more capable than they were at design, right? They're using Patriot missiles uh, as a ballistic missile platform, right? Nobody's ever done that, right? So I mean, the Israelis were toying around with it and then said, that's a fool's errand, and so the Ukrainians can, are very capable of adjusting whatever resource they have, but they don't have an air force. And the Russians, it's pretty clear, realize that if there's one thing they can't afford to lose is their air
Ships.
power in this
All right.
conflict. Yeah, I would say first and foremost, even the ships in the Black Sea, they're sort of writing off. It looks like, just sort of behaviorally, right? These
Mhm.
things just get hit and they can't do much about it. So they're I think at this point just going to protect whatever they can in their navy outside of the Black Sea and just not bring them in, and which is sort of to their advantage that Turkey's blocking other warships from coming in. And But they're definitely going to protect their air force. So if they're unwilling to use their air force to have probably the most complex operation that humans have ever tried to do militarily, which is large scale amphibious assault, is just absolutely impossible. I would argue one of the failures in the West is helping the Ukrainians, or giving them the vision that they should be developing their own marine divisions, which would take several years, because I believe the only way they could truly dislodge the whole southern, Crimean region, is to have a combined, overland operation at the same time they have a marine operation, from Odessa, and then hit the Kerch, I mean, completely destroy the Kerch Bridge so that you trap whatever Russian forces are there and you prevent resupply. That's the only way the Ukraine could actually take southern Crimea and hold it, right? Not that going somewhere and fighting isn't a fight, but it's different to hold it. So that's the only way they could ever hold that. And Ukraine doesn't have any of those capabilities, and the Russians don't either, right? The Russians strangely wasted all their naval infantry on these sort of dead end Bakhmut like fights the last 2 years. So they don't have anything from a naval infantry standpoint. And naval infantry is just a different animal. Marines and naval infantry, right? I mean, yeah, they wear uniforms and they carry similar equipment that land forces have, and that's sort of where all the similarities end,
Yeah.
because all the training they do is uh, is so unique, and it's so expensive, not just financially, but experientially, and the kind of expertise that you have to do. So I don't think either side has the ability to change the physics of the fight, at least in the military sense. These things could change politically, of course, but in terms of the military fight, until either the Russians choose to uh, lower the grade of the conflict, which they at this point been unwilling to do. I actually argue they might have one more Hail Mary in them, um, which I think would be sort of Putin's last, um, roll of the dice. I think there's a 50-50. They try a large scale, basically a Ukrainian invasion do-over. It'll be the same result, because they don't have the operational capability. So just having big numbers, is, looks good on paper, but those numbers have to move to places and do something when they get there, and they don't have the leadership to do that operationally. So I think there's a 50-50 that's what the Russians will do in the next. It wouldn't be this year; it would be next year, because the amount of logistical planning they would need to do. But I give that a 50-50, and I don't know if anybody's really preparing for that. I think the Ukrainians are, psychologically, but I don't know if anyone in the West is, and because it would challenge, so especially post elections, because there's a ton of there's dozens of elections this year. There's already been 5 or 10 in the last 3 months, all over the world, and so it would force all the actors that have been scrambled up politically, if there was a large scale invasion again, to have to recommit to Ukraine. And I think the Russian bet would be that
Yep,
their
they
recommitment would
wouldn't.
be, their recommitment would be, you need to cut a deal. That would be the recommitment. And so I give this a 50-50, and I would say the size of this operation at the low end would be 150,000, at the high end 400,000. And I think it would be measured in at least 10,000, tens of thousands of pieces of military equipment. And of course, we'd see this buildup. We'd see part of the buildup over time, because they can mask a chunk of this buildup with the existing operation. But I give that a 50-50. But if the Russians don't do something like that, they're not going to really change the political physics, because I do think the big thing for the Ukrainians in the next 12 months is to build an organic resupply capability, right? Building their own shells, uh, you know, uh, handling their own maintenance, being able to resupply armaments, especially low to medium grade conventional armaments, to their fight. And I think that's
Yeah.
their priority. And I think that should be their priority. That should have always been their priority, because this is really their fight. And everybody was giving them a kind of a big starter kit. But now this is their fight. And I think it's pretty clear with what's going on both in the US and Europe that even if, all the supporters and all of the state capitals all over the world were 100% behind Ukraine, there wasn't going to be an indefinite check of hundreds of billions of military aid that was going to ever be written, and would never be written for anybody.
Right.
Because
No,
it just doesn't.
Ukraine is on a tighter timeline.
That's right. And
I, I
so,
think I think
yeah.
one of the
Anyway,
questions in the chat, is, you know, how are Russians processing the fact that 300,000 of their citizens died? And I think that there's sort of three different answers going on here. The first one is that over 1 million Russians have already fled the country. And if the borders between Russia and those countries, it happens on both sides, weren't shutting down, probably more would still flee. So that's one response, is they don't want to be involved in it. But the second sort of response is that Putin has engendered over the course of his reign since 2000 that the ideal Russian is to be apolitical, to be disinterested in the political process. And so a lot of Russians, whether they accept the Russian perspective on what's going on in Ukraine, the denazification, the repelling of Western power, whatever motive that's ascribed to the war, they may or may not believe it, but they don't believe that they need to object to it. They don't believe that it's necessarily worth it for them to put their necks out on the line for it if they oppose the idea. And sort of the third point is that Russia Russia is a country where the right of free assembly doesn't exist, where the ability to disseminate information contrary to the government is very minimal. And so it's very difficult to manifest any sort of visible disagreement.
Yeah. And one little correction. So there hasn't been 300,000 Russians killed in the conflict. There's been 300,000 plus casualties. I think that the killed in action somewhere between 50 and 100,000, which is astronomical. Obviously, it's larger than the whole war in Vietnam for the United States, larger than the Afghanistan war. Or yeah, it's probably about the same now. The Afghanistan war for over a decade that Russia had, or the Soviet Union had against Afghanistan. So I just want to make that little clarification. And I think one other, or I'd say the last piece to this is that um, I do believe for Russia, one of the reasons they could look at escalation in the next year is while Ukraine is now starting to deal with the politics of this, I don't know if Russia's too far behind in another year, maybe two max, right? Because, once again, the cost of this, not just human, which are astronomical, but economically are starting to come home, right? So all of the band-aiding that the Russian central bank leadership was able to do is sort of run its course, and now this Russia economically is who they are, and I
And
think,
and I think that
yeah,
actually is a nice lead in to
yeah,
another one of the 2023 conflicts, which got a lot less attention, which is Artsakh.
yeah,
One of the things as Russia is less financially able and militarily able to support its external commitments, let's say, um, we're beginning to see a shift in areas where Russia has created frozen conflicts. And one of those frozen conflicts was the situation of Nagorno-Karabakh region, or as known by the governing body of that region, Artsakh Republic. And Artsakh Republic was an ethnic Armenian created republic in the historic territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, which was an Armenian majority region pretty much for 1,000 years, and one of the few self-governing um, Armenian regions through most of the last 1,000 years, right? Most of what is today Armenia was not majority Armenian. It was minority Armenian through the last 1,000 years, and was governed by non-Armenians. It was governed by Persians, Turkic people, um, uh, and yeah, Persians and Turkic people. Um, so there's a specific place that Artsakh had in the Armenian constellation of a place that, even up until the 1700s, was still while it was under larger Muslim-led empires, the local governors were still ethnic Armenians. Then, during the Russian period of control, which was the last 200 years or so, the Russians generally treated the region to a certain degree of autonomy, and that was formalized in the Soviet Union's creation of the autonomous oblast. But that autonomous oblast was always linked with Azerbaijan Soviet Socialist Republic, as opposed to being linked with the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic. So upon the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1988, there was a war by the Artsakhi Armenians to have independence from Azerbaijan. And with the support of the country of Armenia, and generally speaking, better tactical ability than the Azerbaijanis had, they won that war in 1994 and created Artsakh Republic. And you can see it on the map on the left-hand side. That was all the area in yellow, all the area in red, and all the area in sort of that purplish color. All of that was Artsakh Republic. But then in 2020, Azerbaijan launched an invasion and conquered the areas in yellow, and forced the Artsakhis to sign a peace treaty effectively giving back all the territory in yellow and in purple. In 2023, at the end of 2020, in order to enforce the truce that was reached between the two sides, Russian peacekeepers were sent into the region to prevent uh, further escalation and problems. Those Russian peacekeepers were continually met with Azerbaijani protesters. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with politics in Azerbaijan, protesters aren't legal in Azerbaijan unless the Azerbaijani government supports them. So these protesters were often seen as emissaries of the Azerbaijani government. And the Azerbaijani government was becoming more and more militarily ascendant, both because of its oil exports and what those oil exports were able to buy in terms of Turkish and Israeli drones and Turkish and Israeli expertise in using those drones. And so in 2023, when Russia could no longer afford to maintain large numbers of peacekeepers in the area, uh, Azerbaijan launched a direct attack from its closest point within the territory, which is Shushi, to Stepanakert, which was, or as the Azerbaijanis call it, Khankendi, which was the seat of the Artsakhi government, and forced the Artsakhi government to collapse in September of 2023. And so over 100,000 Armenians fled as the government collapsed. And on the 1st of January 2024, the government effectively ceased to exist, and the area has been reincorporated into Azerbaijan without any autonomous status. Because of the situation, the Armenian government of the Republic of Armenia under Pashinyan, which previously looked to Russia as a security guarantor, is increasingly looking towards the West because it seems like Russia cannot guarantee the security of Armenia. And in fact, Azerbaijan has continued a small level, what are called borderization attacks, which is where they try to move the border a few kilometers in. Russia has not managed to support Armenia, and so Pashinyan has looked towards the European Union. And this has caused a cascade of problems relative to the Armenian-Russian relationship, where Russia is now accusing Armenia of siding with the West against it, especially as the war in Ukraine consumes a lot of Russian attention. And Armenia is continually looking westward for hopefully a better alliance than they had with Russia. And so Russia has now begun to shift and become more pro-Azerbaijani in its outlook, although this doesn't mean much in terms of military support. It has a lot of diplomatic benefits. Aaron, is there anything you want to add to this? Okay. All right. So the
Sorry about that. Sorry,
yeah,
I was
no,
I
I mean,
ran
to
over to get
me,
some
yeah.
tea. Sorry.
No, to me, the fundamental thing about this is that a nation was effectively wiped off the map, right?
Yeah.
100,000 people, which was the vast majority of the Armenian population in Artsakh Republic, now are in Armenia in relief worker camps and similar, trying to be sort of incorporated into the Armenian population in Armenia proper, which the Armenian government has limited funds in order to execute. But we literally saw a country wiped off the map, and it's received very little news coverage because of
Yeah.
how quick and effective the Azerbaijani military was in creating this situation.
Yeah. Well, the other thing I think is important to recognize is that if you look at it, the UN response has been uh, pretty minimal, and the actors seem to have just sort of washed their hands of, this is a pretty substantial ethnic cleansing operation, basically, of a region, and it also speaks to sort of Russia's limited or or tied position because they don't want to antagonize Turkey further because they're dependent on maintaining, let's call it a
The Cold
semi-neutrality
War.
with Turkey right now. Yeah, and right now they don't want Turkey to shift, um, more than they already have to supporting Ukraine or supporting, let's say at least economically, and even militarily. Um, because I do think that's probably the biggest um, non-story of the last 3-4 years, especially the last 3 years or so. Yeah, I'd say 3 to 4 years, is Turkey becoming a real conventional military defense supplier sort of superpower. And especially in the new generation of of drones and asymmetrical technologies, which they've been supporting Azerbaijan, sort of acting as sort of like their Silicon Valley startup, where they apply it, prove it in, test it, validate it, optimize their products, right? Like product development through Azerbaijan aggression, and then basically they export it to the world, and it's becoming pretty effective, and I
Yeah,
don't see anybody stopping this, right? Nobody, I mean, because objectively, if there was one actor that could slow this down,
it
it
would
would
be
be
Russia.
Russia. And Russia at this point is either so consumed by what the conflict is in Ukraine, which is basically my argument, that they really don't have anything left to throw in. And given their history, right? I mean, it's the the and you've covered this before, Richard. The Christian legacy between um, Russia and Armenia going back centuries, and the power conflict within, but it's as a benefactor, Russia has always been a fairly staunch supporter of Armenian causes, um, in except when they're not. And I would say right now is one of those moments when they're not, and they're not able to.
Well,
Um,
they're supportive of Armenian causes, provided those Armenian causes align with Russian
that's
interests, right?
exactly right. That's
Whenever
exactly
those
right.
Armenian causes have pursued something closer to independence or third party
That's right.
affiliation, they haven't. And I think, sort of to your point, Russia sees Iran and China as functional allies, if not real allies. Turkey is a wild card, and they prefer
That's right.
Turkey as a wild card than somebody in the NATO umbrella. And
That's
so,
right.
as much as they can pull Turkey into the wild card position, um, they're going to do it. And I think that
Yeah.
that sort of lays into your
But I
theory
would
here.
say Russia's sort of over a barrel on this because Turkey's been able to use its NATO vote extremely strategically in the last 2 years in the ascension talk into NATO.
Yeah,
That
Finland and Sweden.
Finland and Sweden have gone through. They've been able to, or at least just publicly, they've been able to extract quite a bit. I'm sure privately they're extracting. I'm sure the moment the full Finnish and Swedish ascension has completed, you'll see very large contracts to Turkish defense contractors kicking in from Sweden and Finland, and probably consumer product goods, contract going the other way. That's going to become a big bilateral, sort of pay to play, which was always going to happen. I mean, that's how this works, right? This is not some, secret cabal. It's called politics. But I do think Turkey is using the Azerbaijan conflict as an off balancer for Russia, and making it clear that they can push or pull that string, and then they become this power vote in NATO at this point, and then they've also become this defense, next generation defense super contractor. And then they obviously have this swivel position, I think the fourth thing, in the Ukrainian conflict, given their role in the Black Sea,
Yeah. No, I was
which
going to say
everybody, yeah.
I was going to say,
I mean,
related to that, we actually have a comment, and then I'd like to shift to the next situation, which is that Turkey supports an essential channel for Russia to evade sanctions, and so Armenia is not worth that benefit for Russia
No,
in
that's right.
much the same. Yeah. So the the next thing I actually want to discuss, since we have limited time, is the Mexican drug wars. And I think that this is something that's uh, extremely undercovered, despite the fact that over 41,000 people have died since 2006. And over
That we
350,000
know
people
of, it's
have been,
probably
yeah,
twice that
yeah.
much.
Well, no, like
Yeah.
in terms of the conflict, and
Yeah.
350,000 people have been assassinated, right?
Yeah, that's
So
right.
this is a huge, huge disruption to a lot of what's going on in Mexico. And and it's really important to understand also the politics of the drug empires, because there are actually many different cartels that are operating. But the two most powerful cartels are the Sinaloa cartel, which really came to dominance in the 2010s, and the Cartel Jalisco New Generation, which has really begun to overtake Sinaloa in the last 4 to 5 years. And we should really understand the difference between these two cartels in sort of their thought process. And in the way I've heard it explained, and Aaron, you can confirm, disconfirm, is that Sinaloa was a business. Their job was to get drugs from the producers, primarily coming across the Pacific Ocean, right, to the consumers in the United States. Yes, they were moving an illegal good. Yes, that would cause confrontations with the police and with other authorities. But their goal was as a business organization. So they would make deals as a business organization. They would work with purveyors on the American side of the border, be they blacks or Hispanics. They were open to different styles of leadership. Um, they were operating much more like you would expect a company to operate. Plus, they murdered people. Right.
That's
That
right.
was the murders were always as part of the operation to get the drugs to consumers. For the Cartel Jalisco New Generation, murder is part of their signature of power, similar to what we've seen with Islamic State, for example, right? Where you have large scale murders and terroristic activities designed to promote the brand more than they are for strategic benefit. And so Cartel Jalisco New Generation has actually been pegged by the Mexican government as being far more negative for Mexico and far more dangerous than the Sinaloa cartel, despite the fact that their volumes aren't as high at this point as the Sinaloa cartels still are. And in fact, these two cartels are their own worst enemies. And a lot of the conflict that has occurred, especially in Chihuahua and in Nuevo Leon, those two provinces very close to the Texas border, has been between the Sinaloa cartel and Cartel Jalisco New Generation in terms of their penetration into the United States.
Yeah. So, I mean, my grandmother and my father were from Chihuahua, so I have a relationship to Mexico, and I've always had that. And so I've always followed this. I would argue, so there's something that isn't really discussed often is that there is a construct called the Mexican Mafia, and it's modeled, I mean, almost completely after La Costa Nostra, after the Italian Mafia, both because, that's pretty traditional everywhere in the world because it's actually pretty simple because everyone watched Godfather 1 and 2 like 500 times, and literally everyone, like, there's like it's like an iconography around that's the mafia, and I want one of those, and I want to be one of those. And so the Sinaloa is arguably a family, the same way as the Genovese family was. I mean, obviously, Sinaloa is much bigger, but if you want to look at it sort of globally, it would almost be at like peak Gambino power, right? If you looked at the peak Gambino power phase of the mafia, which stretch through Italy and Sicily, across all of Europe, or a lot of Western Europe, let's say, across North America. You know, it had a very, very large network at its peak. I'd say the Sinaloa looks like that. And I would say, you know, a new generation is a completely different animal. They act really as a challenge to the state monopoly of violence and power. And I think that's what makes them so unique. They have Bark-like military capability. They can launch fairly sophisticated small to medium-sized unit attacks, meaning forces up to about a company level, which is, you know, in the real world, outside of movies like, you know, Sicario, is pretty unheard of, right? The idea that you get about 100 to 200 armed, trained people together, and they launch a wide, large-scale kinetic attack against, you know, a political, economic, military, police, security, intelligence infrastructure. That's much more of a combination of almost ISIS and FARC together. It's what makes them, I think, structurally the unique danger in North America to instability, because of the challenge to the authority of the Mexican government. And when you look at the, you know, the Mexico is a country that is modeled after France. I think most people don't understand that, right? That the French in the 19th century had the largest impact at the same time, because France had such a large impact everywhere else in the world, right? The Napoleonic Code is, you know, 80% of the legal code on the planet. And so the structure of the government is a very concentrated republic, just like France is, right? With the capital state and the capital city having all this power, and then all of the what used to be provinces in our state, 32 in Mexico, 29 of those are fairly weak in terms of their, especially when it comes to military and security. And that goes back to the Civil War, also 1910s, because some of those states and provinces were more powerful, and hence the Civil War. You know, so one of the big changes is that they have very weak military intelligence security infrastructure, which the traditional mafia cartels took advantage of for decades. But that led to this exploitation by, you know, by Nuevo Generation, you know, Generation, as the sort of power projector into those weak states, and they're able to sort of force the, you know, silver or lead choice on those people. And you know, and it's not much of a choice when you don't see the federal government, and the federal government has been, post Cardenas has been a completely reluctant to launch the large scale conventional fight that they had, because there was a, you know, arguably civil war like violence when they did that in the late 2000s, early 2010s. That was some of what Alamo promised, was a new deal, not like an FDR New Deal, but like cutting a deal, very much like the Italian government tried to do in the 70s with the mafias, which failed also. And the difference is he could cut those deals with the Sinaloa cartel and the other, let's say, smaller cartels.
Oriented.
Exactly, that are more mafia economically oriented, and basically just bring the violence down. So if you're going to commit violence, it's going to be against each other, make it civilian free, you know, the usual deal that most states would want to cut. But you can't cut that deal with, you know, Nuevo Generation. I mean, they actually see that as weakness. The moment the government wants to negotiate, they attack the negotiators. I mean, it's so and they don't have there's not a political consensus in Mexico. People have sort of buried the conflict, psychologically and sociologically. And so there's, I'd say, no way for the state until there's some astronomical event that goes on, which I predict would happen. It's just inevitable, right? You're going to get actors who compete inside, uh, you know, a novel, and they're going to want to, promote themselves, and they're going to launch spectacular attacks, very much like ISIS did, and so, or FARC did, right? People forget the violence that FARC had in the Colombian cities, attacking judges, politicians, blowing up the Supreme Court. People forget that, actually, that literally the Supreme Court was blown up in Colombia. So I predict it's sort of inevitable that Nuevo Generation is going to have some, large scale escalation, and it's going to force Mexican politics into this large scale fight with them. And that's going to be, I think, the major destructive activities when that happens in Mexico. And one thing to realize about, so this sort of leads into this immigration debate that goes on in the United States, is that the smugglers used to work either independently, as coyotes, sort of like independent contractors, and then they sort of became more subsumed as a business unit under the traditional mafia cartels who got their cut. But obviously, they wanted, hurting the product isn't a great idea for more business, right? So they tended to value the immigrants that they were supporting in transmigration, and most of them were Mexican at that time, almost all of them exclusively. But then as Nuevo Generation has really pushed itself in, right, and it has the kinetic violence to just push itself in to those type of things. They've taken that over a large swath of it, and and they're running their migration, human trafficking very much like you'd expect ISIS to at this point. It's pretty brutal, and and they're sort of setting the terms as both political signaling, but also just from a violence standpoint, but also just because they can, and nobody can stop them. And I mean, to the point that they've I don't know if you guys remember this, but there was 4 U.S. citizens that were killed in the last few years that were in Chihuahua, and it's something I've never seen, that Nuevo Generation brought 3 people who did that, or they said did that, to the U.S. authorities, the FBI, like literally walked them in and said, here's all the documentation. These are the people who did it. I mean, it was just like the ultimate power play that they could do that. I mean, that's sort of that's peak mafia type behavior, in the 1950s, 60s, right? Basically being able to manipulate the political, legal, system. So I really think this conflict is changing, also because the last piece on the immigration component is that the majority, almost all the people that are now sort of illegal migrants, or that are unauthorized aliens, are not Mexican, right?
They're Central Americans.
Yeah, so one thing isn't discussed is there's been basically a 50% depopulation of Central America in the last 50 years that's been basically forklifted in the United States, and those percentages are sort of sustaining themselves, and I would say accelerating, because when you lose that many people, you lose so many of your generations of good economic actors, workers, people who are educated, can work, can get things done because they can't get them done in their own country. And so those people have been the majority of the migrants, and now you're getting non-Latin American. Well, let me back up. You're getting non-North and Central American migrants, a huge wave from Venezuela. It's actually extending now to Brazil, to Guyana, across really South America, and then a large wave from Africa now that's come in, and Middle East. So because of basically the policy, which is if you can step into the United States, the backlog's so long, we'll give you, if as long as you have a place to say, hey, that's where I'm going to go. I'm going to go to Seattle, whatever. Then they'll give you a number. They'll tell you literally how many days, 1,700 days until you have your hearing, and then that's it, right? And so there's they kind of call it talk, what do you call it? Uh, uh, Form and release is what they call it. Where you
Yeah.
fill a form out and you get released. And so that's become the system, which, is obviously bringing a huge volume of people in. But what's going on is when those people can't come in the United States, they're living in these border sort of tent refugee communities, which, Nuevo Generation can basically just, completely ravage. And so I think this is building itself to a fairly large explosive conflict in the next few years, um, and especially post Alamo. Because one thing most people don't know is Mexico has a single 6-year term, and like all good, crazy modern leaders that are male or female, they want their spouse to take over for them, and
Well,
then
that's
usually
always
the kid
wise.
after that, right? And so that's what he's trying to do is have his wife run for president.
All right, I think we've gotten to our 2 hours. There were so many conflicts actually we didn't get to cover, such as
Yeah.
the conflict
So
in
next
Sudan.
time we can do that. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe in 2 weeks.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. Hopefully everyone liked that we kind of did more of a run through, and then to be objective, we can make any little updates on Israel and Ukraine really fast and small, single slide kind of thing. Because if we're doing that kind of update, we can focus on all the other conflicts, which, there's another, what, 8, 10, 12.
yeah.
So,
No, I
yeah,
had I had Ethiopia, Burma, Sudan, the
yeah,
uh, the toppling of numerous governments in West Africa.
that's right.
So
Africa's going through right now a massive
reorganization.
reorganization. And I would say the biggest not covered and most dangerous of those is Ethiopia. Because Ethiopia, when they turn the green light on at a conflictual level, they go big. They always have, right? It's
Yeah.
their history with, Somaliland, with Eritrea, Sudan, Egypt, you name it, right? And they have a very large semi-modern, I would say, military. So they have a very, very. I think that's good. That's a big
Yeah,
conflict.
they,
Maybe we
they, they
want to
have an
put some.
outsized footprint.
Exactly. We can maybe spend a little more energy on Ethiopia, next time, because I think that's a very.
Absolutely.
I think that's a really important one for Africa, and really no actors outside can stop that Ethiopian conflict, right? Ethiopia is that strong of a state that they can tell everyone to go fly a kite, right? And so I think that's, to me, that's the big one. See
Yeah.
if that one
No,
takes
I,
off.
I think that's right. Um, Charles had raised his hand for a while. I don't know if he's still
Oh,
here, if he wants to add something. I imagine it was about Ukraine. Um, but any other questions, comments, clarifications?
is Charles still here?
I don't see him.
Charles is really great. Too bad. Next time we could try to rope him in. He's really, really sharp too. So, um, yeah. Patty brought up, to bring up a lot more about Africa and what's going on in the African continent, because there's quite a bit going on now, and I just think there's a combustibility whenever there is uh, a continental space that has a lot of conflict zones, right? And we've seen that before in South America. We've obviously seen it before in Africa.
Oh, that was another one
Um,
we didn't bring up is Venezuela and the Guyana
that's right.
dispute.
Yeah, that was really weird, where they tried to do a little micro Russia action there. My guess is one of their Russian PMCs probably got ahead of, in their skis on that one, or, what do you call it, over their skis on that one, a little too much, or test the limits, right? I think that's what a lot of this is now, is when you get so many conflicts, so much going on simultaneously, um, that
You might be
you
able to
can,
squeak through with your pet
yeah,
conflict.
you could get through with yours, and it's like, properties, 9/10 of the law, right? And if you can establish that new structure, and it's pretty clear that given where politics is now, especially in Europe, they're very focused on political survival, basically the individual parties that are in the state. I don't mean the states or survival. I mean just like who's in charge. And so I don't see any European action. I think it is very similar dynamics in the US for the most part. And China is just sitting back. I think one of the narratives, and we can talk about this next time, this idea that China was going to sort of jump in and supplement US, I've always felt was sort of fantastical. I think Russia is the only one that can sort of throw consistent weight around, right? The Chinese it's been pretty clear they just don't want anything to do with
Right. I
these
was going to say
conflicts.
Chinese policy has almost consistently been, we don't care what happens beyond our borders as long as you give us what we want in terms of
That's
resources
right.
or whatever.
That's
Um,
right.
so
And
be
yeah, and I would argue that if I'm being really brutally objective, China has maximize its, we'll call it the most peaceful era in Africa in modern history, in the independent era, and got all of their resource extraction that they could without having to uh, put an enormous amount of energy into it. And now, as it becomes more conflictual, they can quote unquote partner with Russia. Russia can do more of the dirty work, and China has the demand, right? Russia doesn't have the demand internally for uh, the
all
scale
the
of
goods
natural
that
resource
can produce.
extraction.
Yeah.
So Russia gets their vig basically on making sure China gets, basically gets it's a delivery of natural resources, and it's like a win-win deal. Like both sides get paid, and it also it drives China out of caring politically what's even going on, right? Because that becomes Russia's problem, and Russia gets the benefit of sort of its, I would call it neo-Soviet Africa, whatever you want to call it,
Yeah.
military partnership colonization project, right? It's some
Yeah.
kludgy thing like that, and I think that's sort of where this is, and I do think Africa is becoming um, proxy between the Russians and the Chinese on one side, and I think Europe and the U.S. has never really put much energy into it, and the Europeans, I just have no appetite for this at all. So
So yeah,
that's
if you
it.
want to hear more about that, we'll set it up uh, probably in about 2 weeks. And seeing as we have no further questions, I think we can call it a day.
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard, for everything, and thanks everybody else for being here. And sorry for the couple little glitches on internet connectivity, but it wouldn't be a Zoom call if that didn't happen once in a while.
Exactly.
Nice being back among you all.
No, it's good
It's
to
been
Yeah,
have you back. Thank you
absolutely.
everybody for joining us.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Thanks, Richard. Oh, by the way, I had an idea, Richard, which is we in the future do a little intro outro music in those first 7 minutes. Nothing heavy duty, just something to give us a
What
little
like
bit of,
elevator music? Da, da, da,
yeah,
da,
kind
da,
of. I
da,
was
da,
thinking
da,
about that. Yeah,
da.
just like why not? Like our own
Two
little elevator
accepting
music.
wars.
And then what we can do is we can crowdsource it, right? We can ask people what they would want to hear in the 7 minute waiting period or in the after hours, right? Give it a little more of a hotel coffee shop vibe, right?
Yeah.
And
I think that it doesn't quite set the tone, but I'm more than open to hearing what people want to do.
hey, look, 2 hours of conflict and earth hell. We can augment that a touch, but yeah, we could throw it out there, right? I'm up for ideas to. I do think getting into these other areas of the world is important, and then we talked also about doing like an elections special or
Yeah.
two where we talk because there's just so many.
Elections going on around the world. Yeah.
Yeah, and you have the EU elections, which will be a non-event event. in 3-4 months. And then you have obviously, elections all over, I mean, everywhere really, and governments that are changing, and how that's going to impact these conflicts, right? And because these will be inherited conflicts by those new governments, the ones that have new governments, and even the existing governments are going to, question what the
Some shuffling,
resolve
yeah.
is. Exactly.
All right.
Well,
Sounds like
thanks
a
so
plan.
much, Richard. Thanks to everybody else. And I hope everyone has a great weekend, and look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks.
See you soon. All right. Bye.
Cheers. Yeah, bye-bye.